Hello again, everyone, and welcome to session 6 of the United by Sustainability series. So this is our season 1 finale, and we will be interpreting global data with special guests from the ICO. As if you've attended, you've heard this before, but if you're new, we launched this series and want to emphasize it as a place to not only come together, but an opportunity for learning. The series is open to anyone interested in sustainability and specialty coffee, whether you're an expert or just becoming interested. On behalf of the SCA, welcome. So a little time for introductions. Of course, there are a lot of webinars happening. My co-host and I thought we'd have a little fun with the frat backs. These are somewhat ancient pictures, and I don't know if anyone has noticed in previous sessions some of the famous coffee people in the background of my photo. I'm one of the co-hosts. My name's Ellie Hudson from the SCA staff. I am the Sustainability Partnerships Director after working as the PCR, the Coffee Price Crisis Response Project Director. My co-host is Elena Ionescu, SCA's Chief Sustainability and Knowledge Development Officer. Before I hand this over, or hold on, sorry, I'm fumbling with my notes a little bit. I just wanted to say a special thanks to some of the SCA staff that you don't see here who have made this series possible and seamless at times. So very special thanks to Julie Hausch, Sierra Hatcher, Pernilla Gard, and Danny Pinnell. Our special guests today are from the ICO, Christoph and Rebecca. They will provide a little bit more of their own introductions as I hand the slides over. All right. So season 2 will be coming soon. We're looking at maybe June or July. Nothing is defined yet, but just in the interest of transparency, kind of trying to balance with some of the other online content that we are producing, in particular the hashtag Expo weekend and hashtag Expo season content. As always, we're going to start today with a brief update on COVID-19 and any new resources available. So this is the time that I will direct you to your GoToWebinar dashboard. There should be a section that says handouts, or it might say handouts 4 and 5. If you take a look at this, you'll see 3 PDFs and 1 Word document. And in this Word document are a number of links for documents that we refer to today, as well as some upcoming opportunities within that are related to today's session. So at the very top, you'll also see this links directly to SCA's community contributed resource section. So we have continued to curate huge amounts of information of community submitted resources, and there are I really encourage you, if you are interested in just seeing what kind of resources are there, or if you're in need of something in particular, you can search and narrow by region, by type, like barista or technician, and many, many more. Most of these resources are in English, but submissions are welcome in any language. You can kind of ignore these time zone things, I think, because we are have completed this series with this session, but just for the sake of, I left it in here because I think it's important that we are trying to kind of do this at different times, but specific times, so that it's consistent from week to week. And exactly what we decide for season 2 might not be exactly like this, but it will be consistent. All right, so a little bit about today's session. Lots of questions here, and you can see that we kind of want to introduce our community here to the ICO and have them tell us a little bit about what the data that they gather, what kind of data is it, who uses it, what are some of the challenges, and then finally going into a little bit about how we assess, how ICO creates assessment, looking at the impact, and certainly within the lens of COVID-19. This particular section today will have the final 2 sections will be especially interactive. You're welcome to submit questions anytime or use the raise hand function. During section 4, which will be a more moderated discussion with audience questions, as well as our own questions that we've prepared. And then finally, at the end, of course, any time we have remaining will be devoted to final Q&A, wrap up, and some final polls. So we definitely encourage all participants here to engage with our presenters and to submit questions. We do read the person's first name unless you ask us not to, just, you know, as an FYI. And then if you don't want that, just make sure that you state that in your question, and we will not use your first name. But by default, we will. And we're going to be doing some polls today, as always, and the polls are confidential. So this doesn't associate what's displayed with what you've submitted, except as an aggregate of the percentage. So the percentage of the audience that said one thing or another. And so I can see, as those poll responses are coming in, how many people have voted, but I can't even see who voted which way during the webinar. So these are confidential. So speaking of which, it's time for our first poll. And then after this, I will be handing it off to Rebecca. So this first poll section is going to be 3 different polls. So first of all, we would like to know where you are based. This is for demographic purposes, as well as Christoph and Rebecca are sharing their data, just kind of knowing what geographies people come from and may be interested in. And so we know that Asia, Asia Pacific, Australia, New Zealand are distinct places. I am limited to 5 choices, so we tried to group some of the ones that have similar time zone in a somewhat nearby geography. So it's not perfect. Right, looks like about 65% have voted, 72%. And the percentage keeps going down because we have new attendees joining the webinar at the same time. It's kind of funny. Never seen that before. All right, we're at 79%. I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds. All right, let's see the results. Okay, so we have got a lot of different geographies represented here today. Largest being North America, with Europe closely behind. Okay. All right. Similarly, what type of activities are you involved in coffee? And again, this is just so that we can frame some of our discussion appropriately, but also it helps you to know who else is here too, I think. So we're also trying to analyze some of these responses when we're scheduling webinars, you know, just making sure that we have the ability to reach everybody at some point. Right, 65%, 67. All right, we're at 70%. I'm going to give it about another 10 seconds. And this one does allow you to choose more than one response because, you know, many of our community do more than just one of these things. But I'm really happy to see a lot of representation across our value system here. Okay, and then third and final poll before I hand it over to Rebecca. We wanted to ask you all your relationship to data and whether it has changed during the pandemic. Right. And now is as good time as any to also mention Please don't confuse these informal in-session polls with the credibility and legitimacy of the data and research-based, evidence-based data being presented by our colleagues from the ICO. This is our very informal snapshot of people's self-reported responses to gather information. No, that's not on the same level. So this is quite interesting. 78%. Give it another 10 seconds or so since this question is a little longer. Okay. So a huge super majority is interested in or says data is important now. Okay, so with that, I am going to go ahead and hand the screen over to Rebecca. And so Rebecca, can you start by introducing yourself, and then I look forward to seeing your presentation.
Okay, so I'm the Chief of Statistics at ICO. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep.
Okay. I joined the ICO in September 2017, and as Ellie noted, shortly after the US had pulled out, but I previously had worked in a similar international commodity body called International Cotton Advisory Committee. So I had some background in commodities, soft commodities. My main focus is on the collection of the data, processing data, and just making sure it makes sense, is internally consistent, as well as doing the market analysis, which is what you see in the coffee market report handout that is available to everyone. So I'm going to start, so our presentation, we've split up. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to the International Coffee Organization, then kind of our perspective as the Secretariat. It's an international kind of policy-based perspective on what was happening in the global coffee market before the pandemic and kind of some of the trends that are just now starting to emerge based on the data that we have. Then I'll turn it over to my colleague who's going to talk about our assessment on the impact of COVID on the demand and supply in the global coffee sector. And then I think we'll be opening up for a more of a discussion base. Okay. So the International Coffee Organization, it's an intergovernmental commodity body. That means that we consist of members that are governments. So a lot of their focus is on policy rather than making money. It's more helping the sector. Our membership represents both producing and consuming countries, and 98% by volume of producing countries are members, and 67% are the consuming, sorry, that didn't come out clear. So 67% of the global consuming countries in the world belong to our organization, while 98% of the producing countries belong to the organization. Our main objective is to achieve a sustainable coffee sector in a market-based environment. Previously, we had, sorry, to get rid of the, oh no. Did I lose the screen? Do you guys still see my? Okay, sorry. I hid the control panel, but now I can't see my own presentation.
I can take, okay. I have your slides if you want, if you would rather, I can control it from my screen if it's not working properly.
Yeah.
Or do you want me to do that?
I don't know what happened. Yeah. Or wait, let me try. No. Sorry, yeah, no, could I? Wow. Okay. Yeah, like
I can see it.
Could you?
Yeah. It says, what is the International Coffee Organization at the top?
Okay. Okay, I can't see. I'll just try to keep going then. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know how to. I just see I don't see my own presentation is the problem.
Okay, here.
Maybe Ellie, if you want to just run the presentation in the background, is that okay? And then we can just say next slide whenever necessary.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great.
Sorry about that.
It's okay.
Okay. Okay. And that's the next slide. Okay, skip over that one. So our main functions we do data collection and analytics. We're also a forum, which I think Ellie had Kim had mentioned she had come to she'll talk about she's come to one of our meetings, and this is the way for the different governments from representing producing and consuming countries, as well as a private sector to kind of discuss and talk about policy that affects the global coffee sector. And then we also facilitate coffee sector development projects and promoting global coffee consumption. Next slide. So got to that. Okay, thanks. So this first slide, I kind of wanted to start out looking just at the price trend. This is published, we update it every month in our coffee market report. And the thing to note here is this is for starting from September 2017. So it's our composite indicator price. This means it reflects global international prices of all types of coffees, including it's Arabica and Robusta. And the line at the top is the 10-year average, which is around $1.40. And then just below is the trend of the daily composite price since September 2017. The key thing to note here is there was a slight decline, and then you can see in September 2018 there was a drop down below $1, and this was the first time this happened since April 2007. So this was kind of a really big event in the global sector, but particularly for producing countries, because prices had reached a level that was really just not sustainable. A lot of farmers were in poverty. There was a short uptick falling after that when there's the Brazilian elections. It was also the end of the season, the coffee year, so there wasn't as much coffee on hand. However, this was shortly reversed and prices continued declining downwards. We do see another uptick just this past December. This will be important later on in some of the other slides, when prices rose close to just over $1.20, which was much more, make coffee much more profitable than it had been for quite some time, but that was also very short lasting. But despite these small spikes, both in October 2018 and then December 2019, you can see that's still below the longer term trend. So even before the pandemic had happened, the prices were not very sustainable for coffee farmers. There's a small bar at the end, and that's the date that WHO had announced that COVID was a global pandemic. And you can see a few days shortly after there was a small decrease in prices. But since then, prices have generally been on an upward trend, having largely to do with a shortage in Arabica. So if we go to the next slide, we can kind of look more at the breakdown between Arabica and Robusta prices. So we also published these. We have 3 different indicator prices for Arabica and 1 for Robusta. Robusta is the one on the bottom line. And then the top 3 are what we call Colombian milds, other milds, which are the washed Arabicas, and then Brazilian naturals, which is the dry Arabica, dry processed Arabicas. You can see the Arabicas generally move in alignment, but there's a pricing differential between the different groups. Robusta generally moves with the Arabica prices, but you can see it also often will go off on its own trend, and this is really noticeable in the last year. For instance, in December 2019, there was a very small increase for Robusta prices, but not as much as you saw in the Arabica. And since then, rather than any increase, it's just been continually sliding downwards. So most of the current price increase is just on the Arabica side, and even more so in the washed Arabica, which you can see reflected in the Colombian and other milds, which are the top two lines. Because the dry processed Arabicas have kind of also flatlined a little bit in the past month. So if you go into the next slide. Okay, so this is looking at production. These are our top 5 producing countries, all of which are also members of the ICO. What's noticeable here is you can see Brazil is by far the largest producer in the world, which is why they tend to have an outsized influence on global coffee prices. And they produce almost twice as much as Vietnam, and then Vietnam produces almost twice as much as Colombia. So the production's fairly concentrated in the top 5 producers. The other noticeable thing about Brazil is that they have what's called an on-year and off-year, which you can see reflected here, and this applies to the Arabica crop. So one year the Arabica crop is very productive, which you can see in 2017-18 and 2018-19. And then the following year it kind of recovers and takes a resting period, and so the production tapers off a bit. So in the current situation, what we're looking at is their season generally runs from April through March. So March 2020 was the end of a off year for them, which means that production overall experienced a decline. And then generally too, they export a large bulk of their crops. So in March 2020, they're looking at relatively low stocks compared to the previous year, which is also helping to keep prices firm in the current year. What normally would happen is, well, they've already started harvesting their Robusta crop, and then in the next month or so, May, June is when they start harvesting Arabica. But that's something that's up in the air given what's the developments in the future. They happen to be the largest Arabica producer and then the second largest Robusta producer. So they influence both the Arabica and Robusta markets. Vietnam, while it's a fairly large producer, doesn't have much influence on the Arabica pricing because it primarily produces Robusta. And they've generally, given that they're such a efficient producer, they've also been able to maintain production despite low prices. However, if you look at Colombia and Honduras noticeably, they had been on a trajectory of recovery since the leaf rust crisis in the mid-2000s. However, with the low prices in the last few years, you can see that the increases have kind of tapered off or in some cases decreased. So if we go to the next slide, we'll look at the exports. So this is looking at global exports. This includes both the green and processed coffee from producing countries. So the line is showing it's by month. It's showing from October through January, which is the data that we currently have, because there is about a month or two lag between the date of the data when we publish, when we're able to when we get it. So it's showing the line showing the trend for the current year. So it's October 2019 through February 2020, where the shape behind it is showing the range of exports for the same months in the previous years. So you can see at the start of this year, coffee exports were right around in the middle. Then in December, there was a noticeable uptick, probably due to, as I mentioned, the price increase. And then interestingly, exports continue to grow, and this may be linked to the sudden increase in, or the increase in demand because of fears that coffee may not be available later on in the year, particularly if you look at the end of February. Fortunately, we don't have data yet for March, but that'll be something to look for in the next month. Okay, next slide. Okay. So on the flip side of production is who's consuming all this coffee that's grown. And we've split this out by region. Europe is by far the largest consuming region, followed by Asia and Oceania, and then North America, South America, Africa, and Central America. So Europe prior to 2018-19 was fairly stagnant in growth. It's a fairly saturated market. However, in 2018-19, there was a sudden kind of somewhat unexpected increase in demand. And even in December before the pandemic, there was a bit of uncertainty about whether this would be sustained or if it was fueled by the low prices. Coffee was a lot cheaper and but so now that question's kind of up in the air and further complicated by COVID. The other interesting thing is Asia and Oceania has shown steady growth. We had initially estimated under normal circumstances that they would continue this trajectory of growth, which is the far right, the light pink bar. These are all based off of initial estimates before the pandemic. North America also, we're expecting some growth. Africa and Central America, they've been fairly stagnant. So it's likely to be maintained, but even possibly under the current situation could decrease over time. With South America, they had shown signs of recovery because it's dominated by Brazil. They're the second largest consuming country in the world of coffee. However, with the current situation, it's unlikely that this is going to be maintained. So we go to the next slide. So one of the ways we assess demand, and probably the soonest way to get some type of indications besides export data, is import data. So these are imports by the major importing countries: Europe, US, Japan, Russia. And then we split it out by green, roasted, and soluble. This is monthly data. So exports are about 1 or 2 months behind, depending on the actual day in the month, and then imports are another 2 months behind. So there's a bit of a delay because of the shipping process and then when it actually reaches the port. So you can see so we have data up through the end of December 2019, which is where it starts tapering off, and likely due to just the high prices. They may have slowed down the actual importation at that point in time. But generally before then, it looked like there was still, like, growth was being maintained, though the processed coffee, the roasted and soluble, was gaining in share to a certain extent. You'll notice though, most of the imports by these countries are green coffee, and that's because this is where most of the coffee processing occurs. So we go to the next slide. On the flip side so our consumption is based off of not just the changes in imports, but also changes in inventories. Unfortunately, inventory data, there's a very significant lag, so we only have it available through September for most countries, and a few select ones through the end of December. You can see the general trend since March 2010 is an increase in the inventory. So there's a certain kind of seasonal pattern where they tend to build up stocks primarily over the summer, and then in the fourth quarter, ahead of the holidays, is when you start seeing a drawdown in those stocks. The general increase is likely tied into the fact that consumption has been rising during that same period. So what would normally be happening in the first quarter, the first 3 months of 2020, is that there would be a slight drawdown in the inventories, and then from March through June, we'd start seeing a stock increase. However, this is something that may be complicated by, it may either be delayed or may not occur as it normally would, depending on how the supply chain logistics carries out. So we go to the last and final. And then I wanted to end on the overall global supply demand balance. So this is looking at kind of like Tetris shapes. So if you look at the ones going upwards in green color, that's showing when there's a global surplus of coffee, meaning that there's an excess of coffee on the international market, where the beige downward pointing shapes are indicating a deficit, meaning there's not enough, there's more demand than there is supply for coffee. And then the line going through the chart is the season average price. And what typically happens, which you'll see here, is that when it's beige, meaning there's a deficit, prices go up, and then when it's green, it goes down. And that's to help, and this is because when there's too much coffee, the prices go down, and ideally what would happen is more demand would increase, and then would help correct the market over time. So what you can see at the far right was kind of what led to our current price situation. There was a global surplus for 3 consecutive years, not as large as in the past, but still existing, but prices also didn't fall as low as they did in 2000. What we had initially expected for 2019-20 was a slight deficit, but that's also something that is probably up in the air, especially given that it's less than 1 million bags anyways. And I'm going to turn over to my colleague to kind of give our thinking about all the factors playing into where this balance might actually end up.
Thank you, Rebecca. And before we turn it over to Christoph, I wanted to just, thank you so much for setting the stage and kind of giving us this information. And before we hand it over to Christoph, I wanted to also check in with Kim Elena and just see, as you have worked closely with the ICO as SCA's, one of SCA's liaisons, I wanted to just see if you had any thoughts, comments, or things that you wanted to mention before we transition to the next section.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie. And thanks, Rebecca. The slide presentation had a series of snapshots of the kind of data that I look to the ICO for and have for many years. I think I was very early in my career in coffee, in specialty coffee, when I ran across in a Google search ICO data. And it's the kind of data that is really unique or unmatched by any other collection mechanism that we have in the sector. So, the ICO is not only collecting all of this data and reporting on it monthly and quarterly, and on behalf of its members, who Rebecca described, but also there's a lot of utility in that information for individual companies of all sizes. And I think that when I look at the landscape of specialty coffee, there are a lot of small businesses, smallholder producers, small retailers, not only small, but I know that a lot of those members and stakeholders look to the SCA for bigger picture perspective, kind of a sense of how what they are experiencing relates to broader trends and to a more global view. But I think that it also bears noting that while in many ways we have that, we're not involved in the day-to-day operations of running a business and getting coffee into bags and out the door. We are still in other ways looking for that kind of global perspective ourselves, and especially now. So, a lot of the work that we've been doing in the context of COVID-19 over the past couple of years has been very much focused on the effects on individuals in different communities. And so to be able to marry those individual experiences that we're hearing about and the challenges, but also potentially some of the opportunities, and reconcile that with the global picture of how coffee is behaving in terms of production, in terms of consumption. I think that's important for us, and particularly so in the context of the work that the ICO and the SCA have both been involved in for the past year or so. You alluded to this, I guess now it's more like a year and a half, Resolution 465 of the ICO's, the SCA's Price Crisis Response Initiative, which people who've attended other of these webinars have heard about the Price Crisis Response Initiative. And so as we think about the impacts, and we think about the impacts on production and consumption, I think that there's a different way in which to see this story, or a need to explore that from the production side. And so I think ICO has probably a lot to offer in terms of perspective for our audience here.
Ellie, would you like me to take over?
Sorry, do you want to present your own slides?
Or maybe you can just we can just keep it on your computer to be on the safe
Okay.
side. I don't
Sounds
trust
good.
myself. Even after 6 weeks in lockdown, I'm still not 100% trusting myself with GoToMeeting. Yeah, so thanks a lot, Ellie, and also thanks a lot, Elena, for having us here today. I'm Christoph Sänger. I'm a senior economist at the ICO. I must say it's a great pleasure for me to be here because I have the greatest respect for the tremendous work that's being done in the specialty coffee community, which is a sort of a market segment within the overall coffee sector that really spearheads and advances sustainability issues, but also a new supply chain models that also will help to push the sort of the economic viability, the environmental and social viability of the entire sector. So I'm very grateful for all the work that you are doing. And of course, as the ICO, we also see great potential and great value in working with you because you're very close to this this spearheading community where we have a bit more of a broader view. So it's very important that we have this very close exchange like today, for example. Maybe two words about myself before I jump into the sort of our COVID assessment. I'm a senior economist and an agricultural economist by training. I've worked in agriculture and development for a bit over a decade now in academia. I've also worked for the German government and the Ministry of Agriculture in Berlin. I have also worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. So that's a multilateral development bank that also supports agribusiness projects around the world. And since about 4 years, I'm in coffee. I'm a coffee drinker. I'm much longer. So I think overall, I bring some experience to the table, but I'm still in the learning process. Now, so what are we doing at the ICO in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic? So the overall idea for us as an international organization is that we see this global pandemic as a global challenge that needs to be addressed also through international cooperation. So we have early on mobilized all the key functions. Rebecca mentioned that already. That is the statistics and economics function, but also this forum function where we bring together stakeholders in the sector, governments in particular, but also with the private sector. So we have mobilized this forum function in order to facilitate an exchange, an open exchange, and create some transparency with regard to the impact of COVID-19 on the coffee sector. So we continue to monitor very closely what is going on the ground, trying to assess the impact with more data coming in. That is becoming increasingly easier. But also, of course, we need to work together with partners in other organizations to devise specific actions that can be taken to support value chain actors along the global supply chain. And I think here we bring to the table a specific, access to the international development community, especially on the side of international organizations such as the UN, World Bank, but also international research institutes. And this is something where we hope that we can bring our advocate for coffee within those fora in order to also trigger a response that is then helpful for the sector. Now, and maybe the next slide now would be nice. Thank you. So we have seen that the coronavirus is spreading around the world, and we are facing a global public health crisis. The impacts are across the country on daily lives of people, and we can see that this public health crisis has also a serious economic repercussions. Now, what started as a regionally confined epidemic with an epicenter in China has now declared a global pandemic by the World Health Organization, and virtually all ICO member countries, and all, that means all countries that are producing coffee, but also all the coffee consuming countries are affected to greater or lesser degree. Next slide, please. When we started talking about this slide was a bit more important, where we were framing the overall impact on the global economy of COVID. I think by now everybody has read a lot about it and seen some of the repercussions, especially related to social distancing measures, experienced it themselves in terms of what does this mean for consumption, what does it mean for production in specific countries. When we started the discussion, we didn't have social distancing measures across all the countries. So this is something that I think everybody can now relate to. By now, there has been a huge loss in lives. More than 2.5 million people have been tested positive, and around 170,000 deaths have been counted. And I've just updated these figures earlier today. And when you talk about COVID, you really have to do this on a daily basis, because this is a situation that evolves very quickly. Now, the economic costs are also rising. So we see here the COVID impact as a macroeconomic shock in an interdependent world. And let me try to unpack a little bit what that means. So initially, we had repercussions on global value chains that came from a local crisis. So there was this initial epicenter in China, and there were certain supply side shocks related to, for example, the disruptions of supply chains related to goods produced in this area. But this has now turned into a full-blown shock to both demand and supply globally, and this is completely unprecedented in this format. As a result, the stock markets have slumped, and they have actually gone up a little bit since the initial losses that, for example, the Dow Jones recorded. But we see that a good indicator for a coming recession, the oil price has significantly dropped, while safe havens such as gold have increased. Now there's pretty much a consensus around central banks and major research institutes, but also international organizations such as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, that there will be a global recession in 2020. At this stage, they think about a -3% growth of GDP for this year, compared to around 3% plus that we've seen over the past years. So this is a very significant drop. And we know that this has particularly significant impacts related to sustainable development goals of the United Nations, such as reduction of poverty and food security, in the sense that it will lead to more poverty and more food insecurity. Now, the problem is that we see here right now, and it's particularly in comparison to previous crises like the 2008 crisis, is that first of all, this crisis virtually strikes in every country, and some countries are better prepared than others to respond to it. But from a government point of view, the typical recipes that you would use to fight, let's say, a financial crisis simply don't work very well under these particular circumstances. So low interest rates, helicopter money, all of this could be relatively ineffective as a stimulus to help bolstering demand. And why is this? Well, this is first of all because we have supply chains, global supply chains, which are the backbone of the industry, including the coffee industry. They are severely affected, and so are many economic activities within countries. The measures of containment, so the social distancing that we now have in many countries, mean that factories are closed down and large parts of retail, as well as the hospitality industry and tourism, are completely shut down. So bluntly put, there's basically no places to invest money, and there's no places to spend money. And what really bites is this uncertainty around the duration of the crisis. Is there going to be a second wave? How long are the lockdowns going to last? And this poisons both the investment and the consumer climate. Now let's turn from this more global view, let's zoom into the coffee sector.
I was just going to say, Christoph, yeah. We are already starting to run pretty short of time, so I'm hoping with the 15 minutes we have left, we can really focus on the coffee.
Okay, so we have two issues here. Rebecca mentioned already. So the COVID crisis hits the global sector, the global coffee sector, after a period of very low coffee prices historically seen that have been bad news for farmers in particular. For livelihoods, but also they reduced the investment in the sector in many countries. And now we see that coffee prices have increased in the recent term, especially for Arabica, and they're highly volatile. Can we go to the next slide, please? And so if we want to look into why is this, we have to really first think about a sort of a framework in which we can analyze this this COVID crisis. And so our thinking of the impact really evolves around the pathways that we see on the demand and the supply side, as well as additional macro factors. So all the factors that are listed here on the supply side, as well on the demand side, they have the power to push prices either up or down. And in the end, we will have to assess what is the net effect of all these factors on the market. So if you look on the supply side, we see that there are already disruptions of supply chains that started quite early in terms of delays of shipments. The container space available was limited, but also there are issues related to social distancing measures that affect sort of the speed with which the export process is running in exporting countries. What we are seeing now more is not only impact on logistics, but also that the spread of the virus in countries could lead to labor supply issues for coffee farms. So the movement of seasonal labor in particular is more difficult. This could lead to labor shortages and increasing prices, labor cost for farmers. And then we see sort of a long-term effect, and this will data-wise be more down the road that we can in fact see that, is that there will be lack of private investment in this business climate in the sector, both at farm level, but also along the value chain, including FDI that might dry up. And very problematically, if governments have to respond to a public health crisis, they might have to divert funds that they would otherwise use for extension services or R&D in coffee. So we might see foregone productivity gains here on the supply side. On the demand side, we see a relationship between GDP growth, so in this case, the drop of GDP growth, and we might see a recession, and the demand for coffee. We have done an analysis where we look at previous crises and try to filter out the effect of GDP growth on coffee demand, and we see that there is a significant effect that we could see in the past. There are new additional issues that we see here. One is related to the out-of-home consumption that is has dropped significantly because of retail outlets being closed, with a potential shift into in-house at-home consumption. And here the question is also, do consumers become more price sensitive, and will they prefer lower cost brands or products over more expensive ones, including potentially specialty coffee, but also certified coffee, organic, for example. But this is a question of price elasticities in the end. Now, finally, there's also non-fundamental factors that we see. So that nicely ties back to this macro picture. We see that currencies devaluated in producing countries, and that makes these producers or exporters in principle more competitive on the world market. That's good for them in the short term. but in the long term, there might be a problem of importing goods, for example, fertilizer, pesticides, other stuff you need to import for the production of coffee that gets more expensive. Also, not all producing countries have benefited. So that's mainly Brazil and Colombia, but for Vietnam, the last time I checked, it was not such a strong devaluation, if any at all. I think we should finish at this point. The key issue here is to fill the framework with life, so the supply side impact, demand side impact, and other factors. And for some data, we can use the official figures, like the prices that we have. That's real-time data, comes in every day. Trade data, much more difficult, comes with a lag. So this will take time for us to understand. But what is always interesting to hear and important is to get feedback from the ground, from supply chain actors. And some companies are doing a great job in terms of transparency, putting information on disruptions within their supply chains on online portals, making it available for everyone. So that's everything from my side. Thanks so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the questions.
Thank you so much, Christoph. And I also wanted to point out to those who are here and attending live, of course, this won't be available in the recording quite exactly, but on that handout section, you can also see 3 pretty recent reports that are available for download. So, Kim, I know you and I had kind of brainstormed some questions when we met with Rebecca and Christoph last week to kind of plan this. So I thought I would leave the last 10 minutes or so if you wanted to kind of moderate some of those questions that we wanted to discuss.
Yeah, thank you. And to anyone who's attending, you can type your questions in also. I won't dominate if I have a competition from the audience, but absent competition, I'm also happy to fill time with my own questions. And, you know, one that I alluded to in my introduction between Rebecca's and Christoph's presentations was about the changing landscape for data collection, and especially the impact of COVID-19 on the production side. Thinking about the ICO's members, 98%, I think, with the statistic of producing countries are members of the ICO. And I wondered whether, you know, you're getting different kinds of requests or different kinds of calls for information. Obviously, you can't predict the future, and the sort of circumstances we're living are unprecedented in most of our lifetimes. So we can't look to the past few years and make guesses about what's going to happen. But, you know, I did wonder how you feel like your challenges have been affected, and are there any opportunities that are afforded by this pandemic and crisis when it comes to maybe shifting priorities or asking different kinds of questions, or the attention that's being given to these global challenges? That was like 3 questions in one.
Maybe I just give it a go, and then Rebecca, if you have something that you would like to add, please feel free. Well, I think the key issue around the COVID-19 crisis is that it comes on top of challenges that the coffee sector is facing, right? So we have a long-standing issue around economic viability, and before that became the sort of center of the discussion. We already were talking about climate change, and we shouldn't forget that. We shouldn't forget gender equality. We shouldn't forget sustainable production practices, for example. So land use. So there is a whole lot of challenges. This one now comes sort of on top of it, gets a lot of attention, and it is important that when we think about this, how to deal with it, that we think about first the mitigation. We want to save lives, protect people. That also means protect people in the coffee sector, be it on the farms, be it in retail, so along the value chain. We need to protect incomes during this extreme shock that we see to the sector. That is hopefully very temporary, and we want to see a quick recovery after that. But then in the recovery, and this is important, the second phase, we should make sure that we continue on a positive trajectory in terms of sustainability, and that we do not end up in a post-COVID world where a lot of the sustainability gains of the past 20 years are gone. For example, when we think about these supply chain relationships between farmers and buyers of coffee, where you have long-term contracts, where you have provision of extension services, of credit, and where you have a lot of positive benefits for farmers on the ground. If this goes away because a lack of liquidity forces businesses to close down, and we lose these important relationship between value chain actors, that would be bad. So we need to maintain them and see that we remain on a positive trajectory during the recovery phase as well.
I could probably just speak about the data a bit. So a lot of the ICO data we actually get from our members, as well as previous or former members that still provide data to us. So we've already started getting reports. And because a lot of, especially on the production exporting side, these countries tend to not have as robust systems for data collection. Some of it they'll get, it's aggregated up through farm collectives, and they still keep paper records. It's a lot of in-person type of activity, and they tend to not be really well resourced. So with COVID happening, it's also probably data collection is probably not their top priority for a lot of these governments. And we've been getting reports even from some of our like regular member like the ones who regularly send us data saying that they're having difficulty getting it to us at all or on time. I know China, for instance, also there was a severe lag in their trade data in the first few months of 2020, and I think they're initially going to just release the total volume. So it's on top of not having, like wanting more data, it's going to be harder to get the actual data that we want.
We have a couple questions coming in. I've chosen this one, which is a question for Christoph. This question comes from Michael. Can Christoph explain why we are seeing credit constrained within the supply chain? I'm not referring here to emergency loans to keep companies open, but normal supply chain finance. Is it just uncertainty? What would explain a drop in liquidity? No, your sound is off.
Okay, thanks, Michael, for that question. I hope I'm in a position to answer that correctly. I could imagine that it's a different situation between countries, but I would think that generally the business climate right now is very poisoned, and the ability of credit of banks to provide liquidity is limited unless there is really the government stepping in with certain securities. And here the issue, I think, is that while in industrial countries you can set up $1 trillion stimulus package, this is not the case for many of the coffee exporting countries. And here we hope that also the international community can help, for example, through the World Bank, the IFC, to provide additional liquidity for the sector, to make sure that the businesses get through this rough patch on to the other side, and we can then continue with the business and have the recovery.
We're coming to the top of the hour. Should we try to do, Kim, do you have one more question, or should we, let's try to do one more.
Sure. I saw a question come in here from.
Oh yeah, this one from Don.
Yeah, that was a good one.
What actions, if any, are both ICO and SCA taking or planning to take in order to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 on coffee producing countries? Kim, maybe you want to start.
Yeah,
Christoph kind of answered a little bit of this already in his presentation too.
I'm definitely going to go over time here. Hopefully not too much, but
stick around for the final poll, people.
Oh yeah, right. Because the answer to this could be vast, very broad, because this is, as we've already alluded to, such a global scale challenge, and and it's still unfolding. So there's no point at which, or we certainly haven't reached the point yet at which we can say, okay, we've seen the worst. Now now we know the extent of this and we can plan. That I think that we similarly, at least speaking for the SCA, have to take a similarly long-term view of what it is that we can do to mitigate the impacts of COVID-19 on producing countries. So right now, I know for me, there is some part of my capacity that's still reserved for knowledge gathering. Like, we've talked about projecting shortages of pickers, and a few weeks ago that was more speculative, and now we're seeing that. But I think that it'll still be a while before we reach or see the extent of it. So there's at the same time, though, that we're gathering information, data gathering is the whole sort of premise of this webinar. We are also seeing the need to act, and reconciling that tension between not having all the information and still acting is one that's, again, it's true now, and it was true before COVID-19, and it's going to be true after COVID-19. And that, to me, gets to some of the strategies that we know in specialty coffee have a greater likelihood to work, regardless of the specific manifestations of COVID-19. And so, when we're talking about labor shortages, well, we have previous experience with labor shortages and those impacts. So, and we have previous experience with low and volatile prices, and so some of the work that the SCA did last year in the context of the coffee price crisis looked at the root causes of the crisis, and those are the same root causes, or it's the same sector experiencing COVID-19 as experienced the price crisis last year. So some of the same fundamental system challenges are relevant here. So when it comes to looking at the balance or imbalance in who takes on more risk in supply chains. We saw that last year in the price crisis through the risk that producers take on behalf of the entire coffee value chain. And now in the context of COVID-19, we're seeing that in how coffee retailers take on risk too. And that risk was always there. We weren't seeing it as clearly because of the events that are right in front of us. And so I think that back to Don's original question, when we think about mitigating the impact, it's through long-term contracts, it's through stability, whatever stability we can offer, it's through communication and traceability and transparency. And I think there's probably a follow-up question like, will that be enough? And I don't know. I doubt it. I doubt that we're going to be able to use the old tools and expect that those will be sufficient. But I also would not want to forget about the tools that we know that we have and that we know how to use in this time when so many things feel uncertain. So I hope that that resonates with listeners to this webinar, people who are in this audience and looking for things that they can individually do.
I can add very briefly, we are over the time, 2 thoughts on that. So first of all, I agree very much with what Elena said around we can learn from previous experiences. And so while we are gathering data, and while we are identifying actions in order to mitigate the impact of COVID, we can look at previous cases where we had pandemics raging in countries. For example, the Ebola experience from 2014 in West Africa gives a very good example of what can happen at the in economies and what can be done to mitigate some of this. The World Bank has done a lot of work. So we try to go back to these examples, and with that we are trying to together with other international organizations to mobilize the international community. The issue really is that the resources are finite. Many sectors, if not all, are somehow under strain. So from the ICO point, what is really important is that we come with good data with good recommendations to our partners in the international community space, and advocate for coffee, because you can put the money in coffee, but you can also put it in cocoa. You can also put it into certain health responses. So it is important to also advocate for the coffee sector, and that's what we're trying to do at the moment.
Thank you so much, Christoph, and thank you, Kim. I think that is a great note to conclude our webinar today here. So I'm sorry we're a little bit over time. And then also just really encourage everyone to do download those reports. They're fantastic. Some of them are as recent as March, and they're very, very relevant. And then also, as this series is coming to an end, I wanted to invite everyone to participate in a webinar being hosted by the Sustainable Coffee Challenge taking place this Wednesday. There's information on how to join that webinar in the Word document that you can download here, or you can, I think it's probably on the Sustainable Coffee Challenge website, but I didn't check that. You can email us at webinars@sca.coffee or sustainability@sca.coffee if you have questions about that, or want to or wondering where to find it. And before we go, we also just wanted to ask what kind, we were interested in our participants' awareness of the ICO and what they do, and just how much people have interacted with them. And obviously you chose to come to this webinar on interpreting global coffee data. So maybe we're not going to read too much into it, but this is just mostly for our information as we plan our second series, or our second season of the United by Sustainability series. Great, the votes are coming in really quickly. Thank you for that. And definitely a mix. This recording will be available in about a week or so. If you have any colleagues that you want to share it with, we really encourage people to keep streaming these, and always interested in your feedback, and very grateful that you chose to spend your time with us today. So very special thanks to Rebecca and Christoph and Kim. And here are the results here. And thank you very much to our attendees for joining us today. All right, so
Thanks
a little
for
bit
having
over
us.
half. Yeah, a little bit over half. Yeah, absolutely. So a little bit of a mix. All right, well, with that, I'm going to go ahead and close us down and say goodbye. Thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope to see you on when season 2 comes back, or another future webinar from SCA.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.